Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, Emily Baker-White. Emily, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
On this election day, you have a very relevant story about the battle over how much politics to allow on TikTok. So talk to us about the internal battle, first of all, on the colleagues in TikTok talking about whether they should ban politics, what the political discourse on the apps would look like.
Yeah, so TikTok has a long history of ambivalence and nervousness about politics. They used to call themselves the last sunny place on the internet. They really wanted to sort of be a politics-free zone as best they could. And in part, that's because TikTok is owned by a Chinese parent company. And so if there's even a shred of doubt about whether TikTok might be putting its thumb on the scale in favor of one candidate or against another candidate, that would make people really uncomfortable. And so the company's stance from here on, from their founding has sort of been to avoid politics as best they can. But as TikTok has gotten bigger, it is, as we all know, impossible to avoid politics these days. And it's especially impossible to avoid politics when you have 170 million Americans on your platform. That is more people than voted for Trump and Biden in 2020. It is a huge number of people, and they are having this conversation on TikTok. And so some people at TikTok have said, let's lean into it. It gets clicks, it keeps people on the app, it makes money when we're talking about ads. And so some people internally have said we should lean into this and we should just do it, just like some of the other platforms do. Facebook and Google famously allow political ads and make a lot of money off of them. But there's also been pushback within TikTok. There are people who are really worried about its sort of geopolitical plight. Of course, TikTok is fighting a bill in the US courts right now that became law in April and will ban TikTok in January unless it is found to be unconstitutional. And so we don't even know if TikTok's going to be around in years to come because of its sort of geopolitical complications. The last thing they want to do is add politics on top of that.
So can you talk to us about when this staunch stance of we want this to be the sunny corner of the internet, we don't want politics on here, when did that begin to soften? Because you mentioned a story at the beginning of your piece about a Donald Trump video that was circulating. What did that look like?
Yeah, so the executive in charge of the monetization integrity team at TikTok, which is the team that sort of polices the political ads policies. And political ads aren't allowed today on TikTok, but this person and others inside the company think they should be. And so you ask, when did the policy start to soften? I want to be clear that the policy is the same as it was before, but people internally aren't sure it should stay that way. And there's sort of been this debate inside TikTok. So it's not that the company has changed its public-facing policies. They haven't. Those policies have been in place since 2019. But there is this debate raging inside TikTok about whether they should change their tune.
Let's get into that debate a little bit further here. Let's dive a little deeper. Talk about Project Core, something inside of TikTok that's kind of spearheading these conversations.
Yeah, so Project Core is a group of senior TikTok employees across departments. You've got, your legal, your comms, your product, your engineering, what have you. And this group of people, Project Core comes from the idea of sort of protecting and enshrining what is core to TikTok. And that is that sort of last sunny place on the internet idea, right? The company wants to make sure that it stays true to what made it so successful in the first place. And so Project Core has looked at a lot of research on toxicity, what creates like really awful online spaces. We've all been in sort of a doom loop online, whether it's on Twitter, which is now X, or on Facebook or somewhere else, where we just see people getting angrier and angrier and angrier at each other and more polarized, right? And there's been this big discourse over the past 5-8 years now about the extent to which social media may be increasing that polarization that we feel, as a polity. And so really thinking about what role TikTok plays in that and what role TikTok thinks it should play in that was sort of the reason that Project Core was assembled. Now, one of the things that they talked about in the past year was how they should handle news content. This video, for example, right? They're interested in sort of any clips of what they call hard or political news on the platform being put out by your Forbes, your Wall Street Journal, your Bloomberg, your New York Times, right? And on other platforms, there's long been a sort of question about whether those videos should receive more weight than videos from just a random user, from more sort of fringe outlets that may not have the same fact checking and standards in place that major news outlets do. And so the whole prospect of sort of trying to figure out what are the authoritative sources of information here, and can we uprank those to people? Can we make sure that people are seeing good, accurate, fact-checked news? This is a really complicated question that Facebook famously tried to deal with and didn't really deal with to anyone's satisfaction. YouTube has had the same problem, and you know, TikTok's the new kid on the block, and they're going to confront these same set of questions too. And so Project Core considered a proposal this past year, has been considering a proposal on whether to define a group of authoritative news sources and uprank those in people's feeds. And what's really interesting to me is that, like, I heard about these conversations. I went to the company and I said, hey guys, are you doing this? And they wouldn't tell me. So is TikTok currently defining and upranking authoritative news? I don't know. Maybe we ask them again, their answer changes.
So that's really interesting. So let's say this video went on TikTok. It would have the same weight as someone randomly maybe spreading misinformation, disinformation about a political idea.
So not necessarily. And I say that only because there are 1,000 different variables that go into how TikTok or Facebook or YouTube ranks a video, a post, a piece of content, right? And so it may be that they detect some harmful misinformation in another post and they downrank it for that reason. It may be that they're trying to push videos over a minute long, and so somebody gets an uprank just based on the length of their video, right? And I say this only to point out that there are like a whole bunch of factors that go into how videos are ranked. Many of them personalized, right? Many of them is like, a gardening video is going to be high on my list because I like to garden, whereas it's not going to be high on your list if you don't. So it's really hard to say that this video would be ranked the same as some other video, because that might be true for one person and not another. But still, what these discussions were about is whether, all other things equal in a, you know, fantasy world, some videos should, based on their authoritativeness, get a bump.
When you're thinking about the political history on TikTok, where does that begin? Because you talk about this, you know, checkered past when it comes to politics and TikTok. Take us through it.
Yeah, so TikTok started getting really big in 2019, and then fully exploded in the United States in 2020. Part of that was just how the platform happened to get big. A lot of it was the pandemic. People were stuck at home. They were looking for a new thing to do that didn't involve going near other people or touching anyone else. And there was this new app, and it was fun, and it was weird, and it was quirky, and it was just the break that a lot of people needed, right? And so TikTok gets really big in 2020 during the pandemic. Another thing that gets really big during the pandemic in mid-2020 is the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd protests. And so there was a huge upsurge in sort of political and civil rights, social activism content in TikTok around 2020. And that was sort of the first time that the platform really confronted that, like, this was going to be a thing that was going to happen to them, whether they liked it or not. And of course, famously, there was a prank carried out by largely teenagers when Donald Trump was running for president in 2020. This was carried out in part on TikTok. It was partially on Twitter. It wasn't necessarily specific to TikTok, but there was this prank that was carried out where a bunch of kids reserve tickets to a rally they weren't going to go to and embarrass the former president. And some people say that was why Trump actually decided he wanted to ban TikTok. And so this was a real find out moment for TikTok about what it could mean to engage in politics. It's like all of a sudden some people engaged in political activism on our platform, and now we've got this guy who's trying to ban us, right? And so that was, I think, a wake up call for TikTok just about how complicated discourse and political discourse could be. Since then, we've seen the company for a few years really try to avoid politics. And then more recently, they've sort of leaned into the fact that they have all these users and they're having all of these types of important conversations on the platform, because as TikTok fights this potential ban in court, the fact that political discourse is happening on its platform, political discourse is one of the most protected types of speech under the First Amendment, and they want to try to use that.
That's a really important piece of this puzzle here, especially when we think about TikTok potentially being banned. I just checked, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have accounts on TikTok. Yeah. So is there any indication of the future, let's say either of them gets elected president, if they would ban the app or not?
Yeah, it's not clear that the president at this point has that much control over what's going to happen. Congress passed a law and President Biden signed that law. The new president can't just undo a law that's been signed. That requires an act of Congress too. And so Donald Trump has said that if he becomes president, he will not ban TikTok. Again, it's not totally clear. It's up to him. The way that the law is written, fines will start to accrue if Apple and Google do not remove TikTok from their app stores. This is, of course, assuming that the Supreme Court or a lower court does not stop the law from going into effect. If the law goes into effect, those fines start accruing. Those fines can be enforced, would be enforced by the Attorney General, right? And Trump could, of course, say, hey, Attorney General, don't do this. Don't enforce this law. But Trump's not going to be president forever. Nobody's going to be president forever. And Trump couldn't stop a subsequent president from then coming and saying, hey, Apple and Google, those fines have been accruing for years. You want to pay up now. And so Trump may say that he wouldn't ban TikTok and he would do what he could to try to stop it. But the truth is Congress has taken an act. The president has signed that act into law. That's not something that Trump can just unilaterally undo.
When you're thinking about politics on different social media platforms like Facebook, like Instagram, does TikTok have a tougher stance when it comes to politics and political ads than these other platforms? What does that look like amongst the competition?
TikTok very clearly has a stronger stance on political ads. They don't allow them, and Meta and Google do. And so you will see political ads. You will see campaigns paying money to Google, to Meta, to run political ads. And Google and Meta are taking that money and running with it, right? TikTok doesn't do that. But people do post political ads on TikTok, right? They just do so as organic content rather than as an ad. And so if you open up your TikTok feed, you are likely to see, if you have any interest in politics at all, if you're based in the United States, you are likely to see political ads that have been created for the purpose of politics. But they are not ads that are running on TikTok, right? And they are just videos that people have posted that are running elsewhere as ads.
So that seems to be a bit of a workaround. Would TikTok ever ban those? What does the future of this conversation look like?
Yeah, it would be really hard for TikTok to ban those because you're banning a person from posting a video that is engaged in political expression. Now the company could say this is not a place for that. We don't want any political discourse on the platform. That would be a really, really aggressive thing to try to define. And if you ban politics, and this is true even of TikTok and political ads, that means you have to define politics. And all of a sudden, maybe this is a woman posting an ad talking about an abortion that she had because she was going to die otherwise. Is that a political ad now, right? If you say we can't talk about politics, is that politics? And so drawing the lines about what is political and what is not quickly becomes really, really murky. What about, someone making a video about facing discrimination at work for being a person of color, right? Is that political? What about someone making a video raising awareness about gun violence? Is that political? All of a sudden you've got like all of these really tough questions that like TikTok, just like Facebook, just like, Google, these are like tech companies. And do we really want tech companies having to draw lines about whether someone's first person testimony about their abortion is political or not? That's so messy. And they are not the best positioned people to do that.
And it sounds like a slippery slope for certain, but as the conversation definitely persists, as election season wraps up, a new administration comes in, I hope you come back on and continue these really important conversations. Emily Baker White, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.